One of the reasons that I love Jesus Christ is that Jesus never asks us to do anything that He hasn't already done. He never asks us to go anywhere that He Himself hasn't already gone there before us. We're looking this evening at a text that has to do with discipleship. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? I'm not going to do this, but if I were to ask you how many of you would like to be disciples of Jesus Christ, I'm hopeful that you'd all raise your hands. But I'm also hesitant to do it because I think sometimes that we do it reflexively, we do it uncritically, that we don't really think through what does it mean actually to be a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus. I'd like to give you a little context for this passage this evening. Peter has made his confession, "You are the Christ." And God said, "Peter, you didn't figure that out. The Father has revealed that to you." And this means something particular, and I need you to understand what it means. It means that I am going to go to Jerusalem. It says in Luke's Gospel in another place that he set his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem in order to be mocked, to be derided, to be spat upon, to be kicked, to be beaten, to be crucified, to die for the sins of the world. And Jesus wants us to understand that we don't respond to Him in a religious fervor. We don't respond to Him out of an emotional reaction to a mountaintop experience, but that He wants His disciples to understand that there is a cost attached to being a disciple, to following in His footsteps. I have with me this evening the J.B. Phillips translation or paraphrase of the New Testament. I like what he does with this verse. He says, "If anyone wants to follow in my footsteps, he must give up all right to himself, carry his cross every day, and keep close behind me." If we want to follow in His footsteps, Jesus wants His disciples to follow in His footsteps, but He also knew that He was asking them, if they follow Him, to follow Him to their own deaths. All of the disciples, except for the Apostle John, died a martyr's death. And so He wanted them to count the cost. He wanted them to be aware of what it meant for them to follow Him. We live in a world that tells us that everything should come to us simply and easily. We have microwave meals. We have instant breakfasts. We have everything handed to us. And if there is time involved, if there is energy involved, if there is work involved, we become resentful and we don't really get why does it take so long? It should come to us simply and easily. And we bring this attitude with us into the church. And we believe that that discipleship should begin and should be simple and easy. Classic book on the cost of discipleship is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book by that name, The Cost of Discipleship. He was a Lutheran pastor. He was a theologian with a PhD from the University of Berlin. He did postgraduate studies at several other seminaries. He was a committed pacifist. And for him, the cost of discipleship was becoming involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler and to overthrow the Nazi regime. He believed that they were so unremittingly evil that a disciple of Jesus needed to do whatever was necessary in order to overthrow the evil that they were bringing into the world. So he engaged in that plot. He was captured. He was sent to Buchenwald and then to Tegel. He was martyred for his convictions. The cost of discipleship for Dietrich Bonhoeffer was that he was hanged by the Nazis 1 week before the Allies freed the prison in which he was being held. Discipleship costs something. Discipleship requires that we put forth effort. A few years ago, I caught holy thunder because I refused to do a baptism. I had a woman who called me and said, "I want a baptism on such and such a date." And I said, "Well, that's not how it works." Tell me when it's possible for you to sit down and meet with me, and then we will have a conversation about baptism and what it means and its significance so that we're on the same page about what it is we're doing. And you will be required to make promises at this baptism for your child, and I want you to understand what these promises are. And she screamed at me over the phone, "I'm a member in good standing of this church. That's what we pay you to do. I have no intention of meeting with you. I'm offended that you would require me to meet with you. And furthermore, if keeping my promises require that I do anything, I'm not interested." Yeah, oh my. Take up your cross daily and follow me. And to ask to have a meeting with her prior to the baptism was overwhelming to her. She just couldn't conceive of the necessity, and she was absolutely not going to have this meeting with me. Jesus said, again, let me repeat it. Again, I like the Phillips on this one. "If anyone wants to follow in my footsteps, he must give up all right to himself." In other words, all rights. "Carry his cross every day and keep close behind me." There is a cost for us attached to discipleship, and it's one that Jesus wanted his disciples to understand. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He knows what he's going to face there, and he knows what they're going to face. And he wants them, and he wants us as his disciples this evening to fully understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what the cost is involved. Years ago, in a small New England town, there was a pastor of a church by the name of George Thomas. George Thomas showed up for Easter Sunday one morning, came down the aisle, and on the pulpit he placed a rusty, dented, dirty bird cage. And the people sitting out in the congregation began to pss, 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 pss. "It's Easter, and we've got lilies, and we've decorated, and it's beautiful in here." And he brings that filthy, dirty bird cage in here. And what is he doing with that dirty, filthy bird cage? Pss, 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 pss. And then the sermon time came, and he began to speak. He said, "Yesterday on my way to church, as I was coming in to make preparations and finish my sermon for this morning, I was walking down the street, and coming toward me, there was a little boy about 10 years old, and he had this bird cage in his hand. And he was throwing it up in the air and flipping it around and dropping it and kicking it. And when I came abreast of him, I saw that in that bird cage there were 3 little birds. And so I stopped him and said, 'Young man, what have you got there?' 'Oh, I've got me some birds, and I'm going to have me some fun with them.' 'Well, what are you going to do with them?' 'Well, I'm going to pluck some of their feathers out. I'm going to tease them. I'm going to make them fight with each other. I'm going to pour stuff on them and see what happens. I'm going to have me a lot of fun with these birds.' I was astonished," said the pastor. And I said, "Well, at a certain point, you're going to get tired of doing that, and then what are you going to do with the birds?" "Well, I got me some cats, and cats love birds, and I'm going to let my cats have some fun with these birds." And he looked at the little boy, as you're looking at me right now, and he said, "How much for the birds?" He said, "Mister, you don't want these birds. They're just old field birds. They're brown, and they're not pretty, and they don't even sing. You don't want these birds." "How much for the birds?" $10. He looked me up and down, and he sized me up and thought I could come up with $10. $10 for the birds. So I pulled out my wallet, and I gave him $10, and he disappeared like a flash. I walked down to the end of the street, the end of the alley that I was walking in, and there was a spot there that had a little grassy area with a tree in it, and I coaxed the birds out, gently tapping the bottom of the cage, and I let the birds go. One day, Jesus and Satan were having a conversation. Satan had just come from the Garden of Eden, and he was boastful, and he was gloating over what he had accomplished. "I set a trap for all them people, and I caught them just like I knew I would, and I'm going to have me some fun with those people. I'm going to teach them to marry and divorce and to break their promises and to fight with each other. I'm going to tell them that they're the center of the universe, and it's all about them all the time, and I'm going to get them to go to war with one another and fight one another, and I'm going to have me some fun with those people." And Jesus said, "And after a while, you get tired of that, and what are you going to do with them?" "Well, I'm going to kill them, and I'm going to drag them down into hell with me." And Jesus said, "How much for those people?" Satan said, "You don't want those people. They'll mock you. They'll spit on you. They'll beat you. They'll crucify you. They'll kill you. You don't want those people." Jesus said, "How much for those people?" Satan said, all your blood and your sweat and your tears, your whole life, I want your life. Jesus said, done. And he paid for it. This is the cost of discipleship. This is what Jesus was saying to his disciples. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in that book, Cost of Discipleship, contrasted two forms of grace. There's costly grace and there's cheap grace. Cheap grace is cheap because it justifies sin without justifying the sinner. Cheap grace is cheap because it is baptism without church discipline. It is communion without confession. It is absolution without an amendment of the way of a person's life. It's cheap grace because it doesn't have Jesus incarnate and living in it. Costly grace, on the other hand, is the field for which a man will sell all that he has and go out and purchase that field. Costly grace is costly because it cost Jesus his life. It's grace because Jesus was willing to pay it. It's costly because it justifies the sinner. It's grace because it's God who paid the price. It's costly because it cost God the life of his own Son. And that which costs God much cannot be cheap to us. There's a contrast between cheap grace and costly grace. And in the world today, the world loves cheap grace. They want what they want, when they want it, the way they want it, in the time that they want it. But if there's effort involved, if there is time involved, if there is a cost involved, people become impatient, people become unwilling or even offended at the idea of any of those things, though they're true in all other walks and areas of life. No one has ever risen to the top of their field without getting an education and putting forth the cost of the education and the effort necessary to get the training and the education that's required, without working hard at that vocation which God has called them to with their heart and with their time and with their energy. It's true for sports. It requires discipline. It requires exercise. It requires effort. It requires practice. It requires repetition of certain things so that muscle memory can take over. It's the same in playing a musical instrument. I lack the discipline to do it. I love to watch Charlotte play. She sits there and plays so beautifully, and it's because she has put forth the effort to discipline herself, to practice, to learn how to read music, to learn what to do, and then she puts forth the effort to improve herself. It's true in every walk of life, and yet somehow we think that the church should be different. It should just be given to us. It should just be handed to us. Once again, Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow in my footsteps, he must give up all right to himself, carry his cross every day, and keep close behind me.